Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the breakout session number 1 on the policy dimensions of cross-boundary climate-related human mobility. Please don't hesitate also to occupy the tables here on the front lines. Welcome everyone in the room, and also welcome to everybody online, and welcome to our speakers. This session has been co-organized by the Federal Foreign Office and Adelphi Global, as well as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. My name is Beatrice Mosello. I'm a senior advisor on climate diplomacy and security at Adelphi Global, and have the great pleasure of being the moderator for this session and this discussion today. Great. Let me start by framing a bit the panel. So why are we here, right? So climate change has been increasingly recognized as a driving force behind human mobility, reshaping patterns of movements within countries, and we know that's the case especially for displacement that happens for most of its part within borders, but also very importantly, especially when we talk about migration across borders. In many cases, and especially when this occurs in contexts that are already experiencing conflict or weak governance, both migration and displacement can pose profound challenges for both migrant and host communities. And I'm sure our panels will help us understand why in the context where they work in just a minute. This is all true. We've seen it all happening in many contexts. But also, I think a very important message that we want to focus on in today's session is that it's not inevitable, and we really have to be aware of and wary of, alarmistic narrative linking human mobility to insecurity and conflict, because actually the risks that human mobility poses to security and stability arise from specific and contextual factors and inadequate responses. And we know that well-designed policies can make migration contributing to resilience and development in both the origin and the destination areas. And we want to really focus on this in today's panel, really understanding what practical, forward-looking policies responsible are out there that can foster resilience, cooperation, and sustainable development. We brought together an excellent panel to help us do this. Before I get to the discussion part, let me introduce Professor Walter Kaelin for some keynote remarks. Professor Kaelin is a Professor Emeritus of International and Constitutional Law at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and is currently in Berlin as a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. He is also the present envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the former envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative on Disaster-Induced Cross-Border Displacement. Thank you so much, Professor Kaelin, for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a sound check. Every 5 seconds, on average, at least 4 people are displaced in the context of storms, floods, droughts, and other disasters. This is my first message. We're talking about large numbers. Large numbers, even though many of these people can return after a relatively short period of time. My second message: the very large majority of these people remain within their own country. They are becoming internally displaced persons. Particularly in regions such as the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, where the adverse impacts of global warming and conflict overlap, reinforce each other, millions of people displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change remain in protracted internal displacement, with little hope to rebuild a life in dignity. Let's not forget them. Moving to the topic of this breakout session, message number 3. To better address cross-border human mobility, we need to really understand the different scenarios and dynamics of such movements. And message number 4, despite gaps, we do have many tools that may be adequate in one or the other of these scenarios to address the challenges of such cross-border human mobility. And let me focus on this topic and these 2 messages. In fact, there are people who move across borders in the context we're talking about, even though global numbers are not available, a big data gap. But what we can say is that 4 scenarios stand out. First, displaced people may seek safety and support on the other side of the border because the only available evacuation and escape routes may be to a neighboring country, or because members of their own family or community living abroad will help them. Malawi, for instance, regularly receives people from Mozambique bordering areas during times of flooding or tropical storms. Several countries, including Germany, facilitated visa for survivors who wanted to join relatives abroad in the immediate aftermath of the 2023 earthquake in southeastern Turkey. In the Americas, the laws of many countries and also their practice provide for tools such as humanitarian visa, temporary protection to address such situations, and these countries have started to harmonize their policies at sub-regional levels. Second, people may move across borders because they cannot access humanitarian assistance and basic services in their country of origin. Local services may be largely destroyed, such as during the devastating 2010 Haiti earthquake, when people showed up at the border to the Dominican Republic with wounded family members, trying to access and being able very often to access medical treatment there. The envisaged elaboration of a UN Convention on the Protection of Persons in the event of disasters would certainly help to enhance and facilitate international cooperation in such situations. But also another tool that we have identified are free movement agreements. They always have an economic purpose, but they allow people to move to another country, finding opportunities there. In this sense, in IGAD, the protocol on free movement recently adopted provides that people moving in anticipation of, during, or in the aftermath of disasters may benefit from free movement of persons. Certainly a good model for other regions too. Third, reasons that force disaster-affected people to move across borders can also be linked to armed conflict and situations of generalized violence. During the 2011-2012 drought that triggered large-scale famine, food aid could not reach starving populations in Somalia for reasons related to armed conflict. Hundreds of thousands of Somalis found refuge in neighboring countries on the basis of the 1969 OAU Refugee Convention. It grants protection also in case of events seriously disturbing public order. And exactly for this reason, countries in the Americas admitted people who had fled Haiti when a wave of violence swept through Port-au-Prince and public order collapsed in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake. And finally, people are forced to move across borders when large parts of the territory of their own country becomes uninhabitable as a consequence of global warming. As is widely recognized, sea level rise creates existential risks for low-lying developing island states, and these risks have implications for international peace and security. The recent Valepili Union Treaty between Australia and Tuvalu provides another interesting model for addressing this challenge. It recognizes Tuvalu's continuing statehood and sovereignty regardless of loss of land territory. It commits to assist Tuvalu in cases of disasters and military aggression, and it creates a special visa pathway to support mobility with dignity. This will enable citizens of Tuvalu to build a future, a sustainable new life in Australia. In conclusion, to address the challenge of climate-related human mobility, we need to help people to stay. This means mitigating climate-related hazards through reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This means investing in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and resilience building. But we also need to help people to move out of harm's way by creating safe, regular migration pathways. And finally, we need to protect those displaced within their countries or across borders. Despite gaps, we have many of the necessary tools. We need to scale them up. We need to use them. We need to expand them. Let's stand together to build the political will to use that exactly, to use it even in these challenging times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kerin. Really great introduction and really helpful way to frame our discussion. I really liked your focus on, in a way, these three responses, right? The importance of investing in adaptation, mitigation, development, opportunities for people, the importance of ensuring safe and regulated migration and movement for those that want or have to migrate, and also the focus on protection as well. I think it's very important, highlighting that we have tools, we have legal instruments for these, and the challenge, I guess, is in their implementation, right? So, perfect start. A lot of these dynamics will be further discussed by our great panelists today. Let me quickly introduce them to you before we get to some questions for them. We have Paul Junot. Paul is currently the environmental law and mediation specialist at the UN Environmental Program, UNEP, in Haiti. She's been with Haiti since UNEP in Haiti since 2018, and now she's the leader of the Environmental Peacebuilding Initiative there and the coordinator of the National Climate Security Group. We then have Thomas Ritzer. Thomas is the Senior Advisor on Climate Change and Security and leads the climate change team at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Before joining the OSCE, Thomas was a Senior Advisor at the Berger Foundation and has worked on a range of emerging policy issues at the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in New York, where he, inter alia, launched and co-led the climate security mechanism. We then have Nicholas Bishop. Nicholas is the IOM's head of climate resilience and security. He's also IOM's institutional focal point for the Early Warnings for All initiative and the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. And he has extensive experience in humanitarian emergency response, disaster risk reduction in numerous contexts, including most recently Ukraine and Afghanistan. And last but not least, we have Timothy Breyer, who is the program advisor on climate mobility at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Timothy has 20 years of experience in the Pacific Islands region, including in conflict prevention, peace building, and climate change. Welcome all. It's a great pleasure to have you here. So we'll do a couple of rounds of questions for you, maybe first focusing a bit on the challenges and what Professor Kerin highlighted in terms of the importance of understanding the dynamics and the pathways of human mobility in a context-specific way. And then second round, we'll get to solutions. Maybe let's start with Paul, focusing on Haiti. We all know that the country is going through a deep humanitarian, security, but also climate and environmental challenge. And together we worked for a couple of years ago on a study that showed that climate change is impacting human mobility and dynamics, and these complex pathways are playing a role in exacerbating the crisis. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, Professor, for the excellent introduction. And I want to thank the organizers for bringing us here today to talk about this important issue of human mobility. So, Haiti. The study shows that in Haiti, migration has been one of the most visible manifestations of climate change impacts. There are 4 primary patterns of migration. The first mobility pattern is migration from rural to urban centers, which has been the dominant pattern for a long time. Climate change and environmental degradation make it more and more difficult to live off fishing and agriculture, so people have no choice than to move to cities, especially Port-au-Prince, and especially young people. But in cities, opportunities are scarce as well, and young people have no network, no community. So once faced with the rough life in the ghettos, one of the few options they have to make a living is to join a gang. And many are forced to join gangs, even children. So gang influence becomes a substitute for protection and income. Since 2021, however, the year of the assassination of the President Jovenel Moïse, urban violence has reached such extreme levels that a reverse pattern has emerged, which now is the prevailing trend. People have started fleeing urban areas to return to rural areas, adding pressure to already scarce national resources and also conflicts and tensions with the host communities. There are now more than 1.4 million displaced people in Haiti, which is about 10% of the total population. A third pattern would be mobility within rural areas, between livelihoods, like agricultors, farmers deciding to become fishermen, with inappropriate gear and harmful fishing practices, creating tensions with local fishermen. And finally, the fourth mobility pattern is migration outside of Haiti. So most of you will say that this is, of course, this is not a new phenomenon for Haiti. However, it has increased significantly in the recent years due to climate change and environmental degradation, as well as political instability and insecurity. The profile of migrants have also changed, so have the destinations. If we compare this with the era of the Duvalier dictatorship, which lasted from the early 60s until the fall of the regime in 1986, we observe that this time was characterized by a notable exodus of upper middle class intellectuals. The reasons for leaving were mainly political repression, prosecution, censorship, and a general climate of fear and insecurity. Educated individuals and those with resources were most likely to leave. Exile was often permanent and with few returns. The immigration of the last decades, however, is a migration of survival. It is the migration of the voiceless, driven by desperation. The main reasons are lack of livelihood opportunities and widespread insecurity, gangs, and kidnappings. The profile of migrants is also more diverse. Entire families, resources, youth, and vulnerable individuals. The destinations are also expanding. In addition to the usual destinations, migrants are fleeing to Dominican Republic, of course, but also Chile, Brazil, Mexico, and Africa. But it has also become a very increasingly difficult and dangerous option. Many migrants are undocumented, are in an irregular situation, which makes them more vulnerable to extortion, assault, arbitrary expulsions, and institutional violence. In the last years, many migrants have also been sent back forcibly to Haiti by air or by sea. 200,000 people alone in 2024 alone, and a lot more than that in 2025, although I don't have the exact statistics yet. Many deported individuals arrive in Haiti with limited or no social network or financial resources. Many have never even lived in Haiti before. They don't even speak Haitian Creole, which makes the reintegration even more difficult. So to wrap it up, environmental fragility exacerbated by climate change contributes to livelihood collapse, food insecurity, migration, forced displacement, deportation, all conditions that armed actors exploit.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really, really interesting. And to me, I think the case of Haiti provides an insight into how complex these dynamics are. And particularly thinking, we always think about rural to urban migration, but in the case of Haiti, some of the insecurity that is arising now is linked to the reverse patterns of urban back to rural and the competition that arises over increasingly scarce resources. And also really like the historical kind of trajectory that you presented, showing how migration patterns have changed and what is the role, how climate change and environmental degradation have contributed to that change. So really interesting, thank you. Moving to another region, the Middle East and Northern Africa, and particularly I think Iraq. I would be really interested to hear from Nicolas about IOM's work there, and particularly what are the key mobility dimensions in the region, and what is the role that climate change and environmental degradation play in those?
Thank you so much. Maybe just to also acknowledge the organizers, the support from the German government, I think, has been very consequential to peace and security, climate change discussions more broadly. So many, many thanks to the organizers. Also, a special word of thanks to our office in Iraq and our regional office in Cairo for their support ahead of the session today. But turning to Iraq and the Middle East and North Africa, climate change in Iraq and the MENA region more broadly is really being profoundly reshaped by human mobility. Operating, of course, within a context of protracted fragility, conflict legacies, and uneven governance challenges. The main mobility dimensions emerging in the region include climate-induced displacement, constrained return, adaptive migration, and immobility, so this issue of trapped populations. In Iraq, climate change is intersecting with pre-existing vulnerabilities to produce very complex displacement dynamics. According to IOM's displacement tracking matrix, there's more than 170,000 persons who remain displaced primarily in Iraq's south due to environmental degradation. As the audience is likely aware, Iraq is very much dependent on transboundary water sources, which makes it acutely vulnerable to reduced flows from upstream countries and can and is leading to protracted drought situations. So these climate stressors combining with water governance challenges, limited infrastructure, generalized post-conflict fragility are really deepening livelihood insecurity, so people's ability to hold and sustain jobs, particularly for rural agricultural communities. This is also leading to, in line with Haiti, a lot of rural to urban migration. And this is where I would really like to underline migration as an adaptation strategy. Migration, specifically from our perspective as IOM, is very much about enabling households to diversify their income, reduce dependency on climate-sensitive sectors like agriculture, like the fisheries, as has been cited by other speakers, but really seeking to contribute to overall climate resilience. Beyond Iraq, in the wider region, whether you're talking about Jordan, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, all of these contexts are really suffering from declining rainfall patterns, desertification, rising temperatures, no surprise, which are actively undermining these exact same livelihoods, agricultural livelihoods, pastoralist livelihoods. We're also seeing much more frequent and intense extreme weather events, including floods, storms, wildfires, which are driving displacement, compounding existing vulnerabilities. Some highlights, as people around the room would know, include the 2023 floods in Derna, wildfires in Algeria, and recurrent flash floods in Sudan and Morocco. These disasters are actively destroying people's homes, infrastructures, their jobs, and also causing repeated displacement. As I mentioned before, I'd like to reinforce the maybe a less visible but critical dimension of immobility, trapped populations, people that wish to move but cannot due to financial constraints, social obligations, other factors. In Iraq, and I would really like to underline our data work in Iraq, I would encourage the audience to take a look at our climate vulnerability assessments, specifically for the Kurdistan regional government area. But We're showing a lot of qualitative evidence that shows that poverty can prevent families from leaving degraded areas, sometimes resulting in family separation, circular migration patterns that further strain community cohesion. As well, for these same displaced and migrant populations, climate change is really amplifying existing humanitarian challenges. In Iraq, environmental degradation is already threatening durable solutions for more than 1 million conflict-induced IDPs. And 5 million returnees that have returned to their home areas post-conflict. This is contributing to secondary displacement and preventing return altogether. Floods are damaging IDP camps, disrupting shelter, health, and wash services. We're seeing similar challenges in Yemen and Syria, where climate shocks are intersecting with displacement. Finally, as has been stated already, but just to reinforce that climate change is really impacting conflict-affected settings as well, driving competition over land in particular. Water resources are fueling intercommunal tensions and, of course, displacement. So overall, the main climate challenges in MENA are not only displacing people, but also shaping where, why, and how people are moving or not. And it's intersecting directly with governance, peace, and development agendas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Really, really interesting focus on some of the challenges in the region. Really, I mean, to me, really important, the point on immobility. Migration is an adaptation strategy, can be an adaptation strategy, but not for everyone. And I think this is something that needs to be quite front-minded when we think about responses. And also you already alluded to some of the responses focusing around livelihoods, and I think this is going to be like a keyword across the different contexts in terms of when we move to responses, in terms of how do we address some of these patterns. Thank you. Moving now to the Pacific region with Timothy. Would be really interesting to hear more about some of the challenges in terms of human mobility in the Pacific for the Pacific Island countries, and what is the role that climate change and environmental degradation are playing in the case of the region.
Thank you for the question, and also please allow me to thank the government of Germany for hosting the event. As well as their continued support for resilience in the Pacific, as well as Janani and Beatrice and the Adelphi team for enabling me to be here. Pacific Island governments see migration or planned relocation as a measure of last resort. And so given that, I think the greatest challenge is actually enabling the conditions that provide for a number of other adaptation options to remain in play, including the prevention of loss and damages. I'm reminded of the words of the late Tony de Brum, who was the former foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, when he was in a seminar in New York, I think it was back in 2014, 2015, and the moderator asked, is the Marshall Islands considering relocating communities in the face of climate change? And his response was that such a thought is repugnant and an admittance of defeat before being defeated. However, he went on, it would be prudent for us as a government to nonetheless plan for such eventualities, because it's our job as a government to protect our people. And so I think it's within that context that the Pacific continues to struggle for 1.5 degree goal under the Paris Agreement. The Pacific Island Forum has made 2 leaders-level declarations on the continuation of statehood and the continuation of, or the maintenance of maritime boundaries, whilst at the same time they're taking actions to develop policies on planned relocation, work on bilateral migration agreements, and so on. And perhaps just to give a concrete example, I will encourage you to look up what the government of Tuvalu is doing in this space. It's an amazing story. And we heard about science earlier today, and what I really like about Tuvalu's story is they've taken the science seriously. They've started with a question of what's the worst case climate scenario in 2100? Let's accept that as given, and then ask ourselves, what do we need to do today in order to survive that climate scenario? And so, for example, they've developed a long-term adaptation plan, and associated with that is the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project. If you haven't seen it, just go onto YouTube and search Al-Tap Tuvalu. It's this amazing imagery. Basically, they're reclaiming land and elevating land on the main island of Funafuti with the aim of relocating the other outer islands to this main island. So if you like, it's a policy about staying in place. It's also a policy about relocation, internal relocation. Should that not work, they're also investing in becoming the first digital nation, which you may have seen again. I encourage you to look up Tuvalu Digital Nation on YouTube. You'll see some, I always find it heart-wrenching seeing Minister Kofe talk about this initiative, but again, uploading and maintaining sovereignty and challenging the way we think about sovereignty, actually, should you not have our land as a state. And finally, the Falepili Union, which was mentioned earlier as an initiative that can enable people, again, to have the choice to migrate out, not just one way. I think the idea of it being circular is very, very important. And the Falepili Union enables for, I think it's about 280 Tuvaluans to seek residency in Australia each year. They had the first call this year, and I think there was about 8,000 applications for a population of 10,000 people. Is quite remarkable.
Thank you, Timothy. Really fascinating and also very sad, in a way, reality that you're describing there, because indeed it's about livelihoods, but in the Pacific Islands it's about the physical land that people, the physical houses and places that the people are going to lose. And I think really important to remind us that responses are not just adaptation, but also it speaks to broader responses in terms of mitigation, in terms of loss and damage that we need to look at and kind of push for as well. Thomas, the OSCE has been working on human mobility increasingly. Recently, we're working on a study on Southeastern Europe, understanding some of these dynamics in that context, a context that maybe is not as talked about as other contexts when it comes to these dynamics. Can you maybe share with us some of the challenges that we observed in that region? And what are the implications of these challenges for security and cooperation there?
Thank you, Bea, for the question, and thank you also to the Federal Foreign Office for hosting this conference every year. It's really an amazing sort of highlight event every year again, so thanks for that. And indeed, the OSCE, jointly with Adelphi and the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, is currently finalizing a study on the linkages between climate change, human mobility, and security in Southeastern Europe. And what the study shows is that these linkages are very much real, most pronounced in areas that are dependent on either agriculture or tourism, both coastal tourism, but also mountain tourism, where the impact of climate change on livelihoods is just most noticeable at this moment in time. So definitely shows these linkages are there, but it also shows that climate change is one of many factors driving the decision-making around staying or leaving and where to go if people decide to move. So it is a really complex, really context-specific potpourri of factors driving decision-making around mobility. In terms of security implications, the study highlights a few things. The first one is around pressures in receiving areas, and Paul talked about this also in the context of Haiti, and I think also in MENA you mentioned it. The dominant form of mobility in Southeastern Europe remains urbanization, and the large number of people coming into urban centers, whether it's Belgrade or Sarajevo or Pristina or Skopje, other places, leads to a shortage in the housing market, economic opportunities are contracting, infrastructure, social protection, service delivery are all suffering to cope with the influx that can lead over time to tension and to dissatisfaction among the population. But interestingly, and I think that's something we have seen in other contexts as well, but interestingly, the study also makes a strong point, if you will, on the flip side of that equation, which is the impact of security on depopulation or the areas that are being depopulated. So it's not only about receiving areas. What we see in the Western Balkans, for instance, is that it is mostly the young people and educated people that leave rural areas. And what they leave behind are aging communities that tend to be less resilient, and they tend to also have weaker governance over time. And that creates, in the worst case scenarios, can create a bit of a governance vacuum, which then is conducive to the emergence of illicit activities, whether that's illegal logging or waste dumping or trafficking of all kinds of goods, but also environmental degradation, wildfires and other things that happen in places that remain ungoverned. And that has knock-on effects, of course, on security in a number of ways. So it's really both. It's the receiving areas, but also the areas of origin we have to keep in mind when we talk about mobility and climate and security interlinkages. And also a third area that came out quite prominently in the study is the trust deficit, sort of the repeated failure of authorities to protect communities from the impacts of climate change, especially once you're leaving and you're not finding community to settle in again. Over time, that can create as well a loss in confidence in institutions. It harms social cohesion. And in the region of Southeastern Europe, for instance, you saw in the 2014 floods, the 2024 floods, sort of these failures of early warning and resilience and early response, financial support in the aftermath of disasters, all of which is getting better. But there are gaps, and over the years, these things build up as well and can come to a trust deficit. I did also want to flag what Nick said as well, which is that when we talk about security implications, we can't only or should not only talk about the negative effects of mobility on security. We all know that kind of discourse has all sorts of negative outcomes. But also really mobility, of course, as you said, Nick, is an age-old adaptation strategy. And what we see in Southeastern Europe, which is one of the regions with the fastest declining populations in Europe, for instance, what we see there is that outmigration is very much a strategy to diversify income, to learn new skills. It also allows countries and communities to link to diaspora and to expat communities abroad. And for instance, on the remittances side, in some countries in the Southeastern European context, remittances make up to 20% of GDP. So a very significant share of GDP comes from remittances. So it very much also can support resilience and thereby can support security. It's not only a case of this is a terrible thing happening to security. And then there's one more finding maybe from the report I'd like to touch on, which connects to security in more of a long-term indirect way. And that is the impact of mobility and outmigration on the labor force. And what we have seen in Southeastern Europe, for instance, again, with a shrinking population, is that the capacity of the workforce to deliver on the ambitions of the climate objectives, which essentially, to do with renewable energies and the green transition, the workforce is unable to deliver on those promises or on those ambitions going forward. And that chasm is widening over time. It's almost a case of a vicious cycle whereby people are leaving, communities are left in a less resilient way, there's less investment coming in, therefore there are few opportunities, therefore more people are leaving, and this vicious cycle, if not addressed, and I hope we come to this in the solutions part of the discussion here, if not addressed, we can see how over the long term, this gap in a strategic workforce can undermine the ability to meet objectives in the climate sphere, but also just leaves entire countries and regions behind as the world picks up and develops in this direction.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Really great illustration of some of the findings of the study and the reality of the region. And I think your last point on the vicious circle really highlights how complex these pathways are, and therefore how complex and integrated and comprehensive the responses need to be, right? It's about adaptation for rural areas. It's about investment in infrastructure, in services. It's about, thinking long-term to the transition, capacities, education, working with the diaspora. There's so much that needs to happen at the same time, essentially, by bringing together different ministries with different mandates, organizations working at the regional level, share experiences and practices. This, I think, it's a perfect introduction to the second round of questions focusing on responses. I'm keeping an eye on the clock that is not in our favor, so I'd ask you to maybe spend like 3-4 minutes per question, really kind of the key highlights in terms of responses. Starting again from Paul. And the case of Haiti. Haiti is a very interesting case because you have there this climate security working group that has really kind of invested a lot in thinking about responses to the challenges that you highlighted. So can you tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, of course. So what is the Haiti Climate Security Working Group? The group was created in 2022 to co-finance a command study on climate security, which was realized by Adelphi and published in 2023. In 2025, 3 ministers of the Haitian government asked the Climate Security Group to come up with a policy framework on climate, peace, and security. Given the strong connection between environmental degradation, climate impacts, migration, and insecurity, a major shift in perspective is necessary to integrate the restoration and preservation of the ecosystems at the core of all economic, political, and social decisions in Haiti. So a pillar of the strategic policy, of course, is protection and restoration of the ecosystems through nature-based solutions. Another pillar is to promote a peace economy to ensure food security. A peace economy is an economic framework that integrates ecological health with economic activity. In the context of a peace economy, environmental restoration and nature-based solutions and green jobs can serve as tools of peace rather than marginalization. They are also very powerful approaches for the reintegration of migrants and displaced people, creating value in the process. But nature-based solutions and green jobs are not sufficient on their own because they operate within and are constrained by larger structural systems. Stabilization and reintegration will only be deemed successful when returning individuals achieve a level of economic autonomy, social stability, and psychosocial well-being that allows them all to choose to settle in their community rather than migrate out of necessity. Sustainability is the key here, so is socioeconomic mobility. But it is challenging to scale up successful nature-based solutions such as agroecology without securing property rights or land use. And the land issue in Haiti, however, is one of the guardian nuts of insecurity. The lack of clarification and security of land tenure hinders access to credit and investment. Land conflicts are widespread in Haiti, and land grabbing is frequent. Land formalization demands considerable technical and financial resources, making it difficult for vulnerable populations to access. Additionally, it requires continuous updates to remain relevant. And in Haiti, the very structure of rural land with 1 million agricultural holdings is also a problem, just as much as the issue of securing land titles. Access to land for young people mainly occurs through inheritance, a pathway that has become increasingly difficult and where co-ownership often works against them. These challenges lead them to turn away from agriculture and leave rural areas for urban centers, fueling the vicious cycle that Thomas was talking about of human mobility and insecurity. So the strategic policy framework suggests a more flexible solutions for securing land rights and preventing conflicts, such as a basic land plan, which is a simplified version of land registration, as well as flexible communal adaptive land relationships, which resonate with historical values of l'Écoute and enables to share resources. But there are also commercial barriers. The drastic liberalization of agricultural market in the 90s, involving the removal of trade barriers and subsidies to local farmers, had profound effects on local agriculture. This not only led to a decline in local agricultural production, but also triggered a rural exodus, as many farmers could no longer compete with the incoming flow of cheaper imported goods and still can't. Again, that vicious circle that you were talking about, Thomas. So the resultant migration exacerbated insecurity and still does, and increased the vulnerability of communities to climate change. In light of these challenges, it is essential to adjust the tariff profile. So there are many additional challenges, but I will stop here. And the key point here is that they must be addressed in a comprehensive way, and this is what the national strategic policy on environment, climate, peace, and security is aiming to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Very important there to put the accent on the integrated responses that need to happen and how Haiti is moving towards this direction. Nicolas, going back to you, I was wondering if you could share with us some of the experiences of IOM responding to these challenges in the region, working with partners at the local, national level, regional level. What can we learn from your experience?
Thank you so much for the question. So IOM is actively partnering with governments across the Middle East and North Africa region to really try and shape and build evidence-based peace-responsive policies. I'd like to point to a few maybe. In Iraq, IOM has been supporting the government to develop a human mobility chapter in Iraq's National Adaptation Plan. Obviously, the new NAPs that are coming forward now really represent key instruments for identifying not only climate priorities, but also how to better access climate finance, as was alluded to in the opening plenary, the second plenary this morning. Building on this, and I think really critically, is work that IOM is doing to help develop not only national adaptation plans, but also local adaptation plans that are really, in Iraq at least, applying human mobility typologies at the governorate level. So really trying to ground national policy development into localized realities. And to complement this, we have also developed a guidance note on climate-related dispute resolution and mediation, something that we discussed at a workshop yesterday on climate-related engagement and peace processes. These are trying to provide tools that manage environmental tensions and prevent conflict linked to, as I mentioned earlier, water scarcity and land degradation. So I think a lot of similarities between the various contexts that are being presented today. But perhaps importantly, IOM is also working very closely with the government of Iraq this year, as they are currently the co-chair for the G77 plus China, where we're really trying to help the represented countries within that consortium to ensure that human mobility remains a priority issue within global climate negotiations. We've been trying to put together a couple of workshops to support experts and negotiators ahead of COP to dialogue on things like the global goal on adaptation, loss and damage, other critical themes that will come out at COP30 in Belém. And relatedly, we're also developing a related study on the interaction between climate change, biodiversity loss, and human mobility within Iraq. So keep your eyes open for that one. Yeah, so I mean, the NAPs and also engagement with the new generation of NDCs is something that we're pursuing across the wider region, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, really trying to work holistically with a lot of governments across the region to embed human mobility considerations in these new documents. A lot of which we're hoping to see at COP30. I think there might be up to 80 to 90 new NDCs released very shortly, so very positive advancement there. And maybe just to conclude, but I'd really like to place a pin, and the PBF director mentioned similar this morning during his remarks, but we really place a strong emphasis on youth and community engagement. So this was exemplified earlier this year in a regional youth climate mobility innovation forum and hackathon that we hosted at our regional office in Cairo, as well as through a youth green caravan where we work to mobilize young people and local actors to design community-based adaptation solutions. So collectively, we feel that these types of initiatives really demonstrate a comprehensive approach to embedding human mobility in climate frameworks, where we're trying to link adaptation and peace building by empowering youth, leveraging evidence and data, and so on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. Impressive work. We'll definitely keep our eyes open for the study that you mentioned. I also, I was thinking as you were speaking, it's a very good way of showing how you do, the vertical integration that Marcus was referring to also in the previous plenary, in terms of working at the local level, at the national level, but making sure that you also connect to the global processes. And you mentioned the work that is going into integrating human mobility into the NAPs and disease. So yeah, really interesting fascinating work that you're doing. Thanks for sharing it with us. Tim, you already mentioned some of the responses at the national level to Tuvalu, Marshall Islands. I was wondering if you could spend some words maybe on the kind of regional experiences of working at the Pacific Island Forum or other regional fora that exist in addressing these challenges.
Thank you. So back in 2023, the leaders of the Pacific Island Forum endorsed the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. I believe it's the first of its kind, although there was a declaration, I think, in Africa that's similar. In line with the comments I made earlier, the framework's underpinned by some principles, including the protection of statehood, the protection of human rights and human security, and the protection of traditional knowledge and practices as well. And also it covers the suite of mobility actions, so staying in place, displacement, migration and planned relocation. It's also got stranded migrants because it was being negotiated during COVID. So it kind of sticks out a little bit, that one, but it's in there as well. And then to bring this to life, just in August, our governments endorsed an implementation plan for the regional framework for 2025 to 2030. And what we've tried to do with the implementation plan is to, again, recognize that countries are at different places when it comes to climate mobility. They have different priorities. And so rather than just impose a one-size-fits-all solution, we've tried to create this supportive ecosystem that governments can tap into as and when they need it. And really the crux of the implementation plan is putting the government in the driver's seat, a government official in the driving seat, and helping them answer questions such as, who is at risk of climate displacement in my country? Where are they located? How many of them are there? Where are they likely to go? And then giving the necessary technical and financial support to help that government then take action based on that information. And I'm happy to say we're working very closely with the IOM on their risk index for climate displacement and their climate catalytic fund, which addresses those issues, if you like. They're currently being piloted in Vanuatu and Fiji. We also have the Pacific Resilience Facility, which the government of Germany mentioned this morning that they've made a contribution to. Any other states that are in the room, we welcome your contributions as well, which is really, again, about getting money to the communities on the ground. Those really small scale, quick access grants. And we also recognize that the Pacific is leading the world on a lot of this stuff. If you look at what Fiji is doing, for example, on planned relocation, they have planned relocation guidelines, they have it integrated into their Climate Act, they have standard operating procedures, and they have a specific fund set aside, a trust fund set aside to support planned relocation. So in recognition of that, we're also facilitating peer-to-peer exchanges with other governments. And for example, the government of Vanuatu is pretty keen to come to Fiji and learn from them. So it's all happening in the Pacific, and we welcome any partners who want to join us. And if you want to come over and, again, have a fruitful and meaningful exchange.
Thank you so much, Tim. Direct call to action and invite to visit the Pacific Islands. So here we are. No, thanks so much. Really important point there, which links very well to the question that I have for Thomas on regional framework, but also an implementation plan, right? Like moving from paper to action. And I was wondering then for Thomas, if you have any final reflections or thoughts to share in terms of what are the main policy obstacles that remain to moving, we all know the challenges, we've been discussing them. what are the obstacles to acting politically to those? And maybe, linking again to what Tim was saying in terms of the role of regional organizations, as you sit here representing the OSCE, what is the role that regional organizations can play in overcoming some of these barriers to action at the national level or local level?
Yeah, thanks for that. Good question. In terms of the challenge, when we look at Southeastern Europe, for instance, but I'm sure it's the same in the other regions as well, it's clear that each country, even within each country, you see different challenges, different vulnerabilities, different capacities, also, frankly, very different political priorities as relates to climate change, but also mobility and security. So it is no small challenge to bring all of this into one cohesive framework. And that fragmentation at the national and subnational level, of course, reflects even more so at the regional level. So it is a formidable challenge to connect those different points in a coherent way across multiple jurisdictions. I think what we would like to see at the regional level or at the political level across vertical levels, I think we have to start with the greenhouse gas emissions. The professor said in the opening remarks, of course, we're talking about climate-related mobility here, so it kind of all starts with climate action and more ambitious climate targets. That's, of course, one point we want to see. I'll try to be quick and not repeat what's been said before. Better governance and integrated frameworks is a key point. June, I think, thanks so much for everything you'd laid out, and Haiti sounds like a very good example. So I think I don't have to elaborate on that. I think everything you said about the Haiti context is what we want to see writ large in other places as well. An important point, I think, is also the investment in both people and skills that speaks to the workforce gaps I mentioned earlier. So clearly there's something about reskilling workers who currently, for instance, in the fossil fuel industries, which is in significant numbers in Southeastern Europe, but also in many other regions. So there needs to be a reskilling, upskilling process to take care and provide protections for those people. But also investing in rural livelihoods, in rural governance, creating opportunities away from urban centers as well is going to be very important. The evidence base is a key factor as well. We need the evidence base, of course, to understand the complex context-specific factors we've all been discussing for the past hour here. First of all, to drive policymaking and make sure the decisions are being taken on the best possible evidence base we have, but also to develop at the regional level, ultimately, a shared understanding of the risk landscape. In one of the opening segments and one of the opening panels today, shared truths was mentioned, and I think it's very much true also for our conversation here. We need a shared understanding of risks as a baseline to develop shared solutions. So evidence base for that is also very important. And then I think, writ large, we'd want to see a bit of a mindset shift from looking at climate change and mobility as sort of this threat we all have to be aware of and afraid of, and kind of trying to push it down and lower it, moving from that mindset towards a mindset of understanding this is a regional challenge we have to manage together, can only manage together, and it not only offers risks, it also offers opportunities. We talked earlier about remittances and other implications on stability. They're actually positive if managed correctly. And we heard from the professor also about legal pathways for labor migration, for instance. I just want to touch briefly on, because you asked about regional organizations. I think there are a few things regional organizations can do, and thanks, Tim, I think very good points that we also subscribe at the OSCE. One point, of course, is providing this institutional framework for collaboration that also moves beyond the ad hoc to really institutionalized frameworks, provide a forum and hold the space for dialogue, especially, including, but also especially when tensions rise, but also do it in a way that does not impose, that reflects the individual priorities of countries and is sort of an offer rather than a strict straitjacket. That's clearly a point for regional organizations. Also, the evidence base, which is what our study, with generous support of the United Kingdom that we're finalizing right now, what our study tries to do. So there's something about evidence base that regional organizations can contribute. There's also a lot around promoting inclusive action and sort of pushing for a grounding of the agenda in the lived experiences of the people most relevant and most affected by it. And I'll probably end on one point, though. It's also important for regional organizations to not fall into this trap of just being the platform for dialogue. I think we also need to be clear, especially from a perspective of participating states or member states, the dialogue platform is important, but if the dialogue does not come with action, it loses interest. And I think we need to be clear that dialogue is important, but it needs to lead to tangible improvements in the lives and livelihoods of people. Otherwise, this journey is not going to go where it needs to go.
Wow, great. Thanks so much. Really sticking with me is the mindset shift, moving towards the framing around opportunities rather than risks. And this point about, regional organizations are for facilitating dialogue, but it can't stop at dialogue. Dialogue is important, but we need to move to action that is evidence-based. Wow, what a rich panel. We don't have a lot of time. That's what you get with an Italian moderator, that she doesn't look at the clocks too much. But I'm very keen to have a round of, maybe not questions, because we won't have time for answers, but a quick round of thoughts and reflections from the audience. Maybe I'll get 3 or 4. If you can introduce yourself and be brief, that would be fantastic. Also questions that the speakers can answer to you during the lunch break. Please. Here's a microphone for you.
Yeah, Hello? Yeah, hi. Well, thank you very much, Beatrice and the panel. My name is Thomas, I work for Oxfam. And I actually had a question, but I now understand that.
Go ahead.
But I can sort of try and put it into a comment. So as a practitioner organization, as Oxfam, we work with people on the move. We provide support to IDPs, to migrants. That, of course, requires short-term assistance, often in protracted crises as well. And we also work as Oxfam on climate resilience, climate adaptation, climate justice. And we, as practitioners, find it quite hard sometimes to program for these integrated solutions that the panel has been talking about, or the sort of holistic, longer-term, shorter-term interventions that are required to address the challenges and seize the opportunities, as Thomas was also mentioning. So my question was going to be around that, perhaps that we can reflect about that, but it was more what the panel thinks and their reflections are on what the international community or national governments can do to make these integrated solutions possible. Because we still, and again I speak as a practitioner organization, we still are either working on the sort of shorter term challenges that these dynamics are causing, or the more longer term adaptation challenges as well. So yeah, I was curious to hear what advice the panel had on to the international community or to national governments on how to. You also said let's move from action to words. Let's not do that. Move from words to action is something we hear a lot. We are ready to take action. We are taking action, but sometimes we're also in that strangle still after all those years of working in silos.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. Very good question. Is another lady there who would like to speak?
Hi, my name is Sophia from the Austrian Center for Peace, and my reflection is on this notion of mobility and migration as an opportunity. And I hear that repeatedly, and I totally agree, but I find it so hard to make that a shared truth, to really convene that message. I think it just doesn't go really through. And the same argument with let's support people to stay as an argument for more investment in like fragile countries, for instance. And I always also see it hard for our governments, for instance, in Europe, to really buy into that argument. So that would be my question, that how to make that a shared truth, maybe.
Very good question indeed. As a lady there.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi. My name is Kira Tarif. I work for the SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Thank you so much to the panelists for this really interesting conversation. I think I want to build a little bit on what Sophia was saying, but maybe pose it a bit more bluntly. What's notable about the discussion on climate, mobility, maybe peace and security, is the gap between the evidence and the research on how climate change relates to human mobility and immobility, and the political sort of discourse about this topic, especially in the global north. And I'm wondering if the panelists could share some reflections on what this community of practice here could do to sort of address that gap and to bring more nuance to the discussion about this topic in some policy discourse. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really, really good questions. We have 2 minutes and 36 seconds. Why don't I give you, oh, there's another question? Oh, over there. Okay, last one. And then I'm going to give one sentence to each panelist to respond to some of these points and some concluding words to Professor Kellin. Yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you so much. Directors and panelists, really appreciate for sharing your insights and different perspective on this specific issue. So my name is Ru Chang-gang from the the Secretariat of United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So migration is one of our topic for countries to discuss and make a decision on this issue. I'm wondering whether about, if you have panelists have 1 minute to speak with the minister who can make a decision on this migration issue, what would be your sort of pitch when it comes to policy making or decision making? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have one question about how do we make integrated solutions possible. One is how do we create a shared truth around opportunities. Community of practice, how do we create the evidence, and a 1-minute pitch to policymakers to move to solutions. You can pick one of them and give a 1-minute answer, starting with Tim.
Great, thank you. Look, all I'll say is, I've heard some of these kind of discussions over the last couple of days. Every time I've heard them, I've just thought, come to the Pacific. Maybe I'm missing something, or maybe you'll learn something that can help answer your concerns and questions. And on the last one, I'd probably just say understand the risk clearly. Particularly in our region, we want to shift away from concepts of sinking islands and climate refugees to actually understand the concrete risks that communities are facing.
Thank you. Nick?
1 minute. That's tough. These are really typical questions, I think, that come up time and time again. I'm not sure that there's a lack of data anymore. There's definitely not a lack of acknowledgement or recognition. I do believe that there's a tremendous amount of recognition around the opportunities represented by mobility writ large. I do think there needs to be much more focus on knowledge transfer, however. So one of the outcomes from our workshop yesterday morning was that, talking about climate, peace, and security is one thing, but actually moving forward and making sure that climate is center in peace and security discussions is really still an uphill battle, but something that's really worth emphasizing. And I think that came out in the message this morning from the EU's climate envoy. So I really think that there's grounds and space to ensure that climate is not an afterthought in peace and security discussions, but something that is really the preeminent driver of some of those situations that needs to be accounted for much more centrally. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Nick Thomas.
Thank you. Well, it's blinking in red already. Great. I think a lot of it is just to go back to the mindset. A lot of it is in the mindset, I think, and not to say it's only an opportunity and to disregard the risk related to mobility, but it's also not only risk, it's not only downside. And some of the questions as they came, they're all very good. I think they also have a circular logic in how we respond to them. It's addressing all of them or none of them in terms of how you make the case politically, how you therefore are able to develop more integrated solution or pathways towards solutions. right now it feels like we are stuck in a cycle of political rhetoric dominated by populist messaging around reducing support to fragile communities where people are unable to stay and then close the doors, and sort of it's actually like a self-perpetuating cycle by not supporting people in vulnerable situations and then complain about influx if that happens towards us, and sort of drumming up a theater of threat. So I think a lot of is the political mindset, and that's also the messaging I would convey to ministers to take a broader approach to it and sort of elevate it up.
Thanks, Thomas. Paul?
Okay, I'll be only 5 seconds. I would say think outside the box. We need to change the way we see property, frontiers, nature. We need to change the way we address these issues, and I would say thinking outside the box is the key here. We can't go and do over the same things again. That's it.
Thank you, Paul. Professor Kellin, any final thoughts or reflections from you?
No wise words from the professor, but 3 things stick out and stick with me from this discussion. First, the need to really take seriously the multi-causality of movements in climate disaster contexts. Second, the need to find a proper balance between the wish of people to stay and their wish to move in certain situations. And third, we have so many tools, but let's think through a comprehensive toolbox, and let's also then look for the financing of all elements of that toolbox. And finally, 2 answers. Europe, look at what's happening in the Pacific, in Central America, in Africa. It's so lively. We in Europe are way behind these discussions. And to Oxfam, from my practical work, I think what works best is what we call area-based approaches, but institutionalized. For instance, as we suggested in the Niger Durable Solutions strategy, to use municipal and sub-regional district development planning. Then you have all the actors on board automatically and the nexus, and can look at the short and the long term.
Thank you so much, Professor Kellin. Perfect summary and conclusion of our discussion today. Thank you so much to all of you for choosing our breakout session. I hope you found it interesting and for sticking with us despite the slight delay. Thank you so much to our panelists, incredible insights, and to our keynote speaker, Professor Kellin. I really learned a lot. Thank you to the OSCE for the partnership to organize this session. And with this, I will release you all to lunch, which is served, I think, on both sides of this room, like similarly to the coffee break. And we will reconvene back at 2 p.m. sharp. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.